Okay, hey, welcome to the podcast. It's the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey. Hey, before we start this episode, I want to plug my Patreon for the first time in a while. Friday night's secret stream was so good that I honestly just want to make it an opportunity for more people to participate. $5 a month. I mean, why would you not? And we can do 2 Friday night streams together. Starts at 9 p.m., usually goes till midnight. You can participate. You can just listen. You can throw fire from the chat, whatever you want. The streams stay secret. They usually go for about 3 hours, so you're talking 6 hours of content a month. This is a deal. The link to my Patreon is in the description. For this episode, we're going to be talking about Chinese novelist, mainly short story writer, Lu Xun. I'm actually reading out of the Norton anthology, though. I've got a translation by William Lyle that I like better than the one that I ordered last week here. So, Lu, and I'm only going to do, just bear with me, because this is a really interesting story. I'm going to go about 7 or 10 minutes on like background stuff, and then just kind of walk through the story and give you I'm just going to read from it a little bit and add a little bit of commentary. Lu Xun is the pen name of a Chinese writer born with the name Zhu Shuren in 1881. He's generally recognized now as one of the best Chinese modernists, the best of their 20th century writers. In spite of the fact that he never formally joined the Communist Party, he was admired by Mao and generally hailed by Mao's regime after 1949. He came from a family that had been prosperous for a long time, but had recently run into difficult times, very much like Herman Melville's family, actually. As a result of threatening financial difficulties, he could not afford the schooling that would lead to the traditional Confucian education or career, and he had to settle for the military school that specialized in Western education. This was apparently a sort of disgrace to his family, but this is also where he first became acquainted with Western literature by way of writers like T.H. Huxley, John Stuart Mill, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and so on. He studied German and English and Russian, and he went on to read Nietzsche carefully. He was 31 years old when the Qing dynasty ended after the Chinese Revolution began to aim at modernization. A few years later, in 1915, after studying Buddhism and Tang Dynasty poetry, he was forced to participate in certain Confucian rituals, which he ridiculed in his private journal. And then he published his Diary of a Madman 3 years later in 1918. So that's what we're talking about, his story, Diary of a Madman. It calls it a novel here. It's not a novel. It's about a 12-page story. Very short read. You can find a PDF of it online. It's a really good, interesting read. And for me, it's right up there with like Bartleby the Scrivener or with Kafka's Metamorphosis in terms of its diagnosis of, like what's not working about the modern. I'm not even sure he intended all of it to read this way, but I have an interpretation of it that I think is interesting. So I'm, first of all, not an expert on Lu Xun. I don't read Chinese. I mean, this is all I'll say about his biography, basically, what I've said already. And I want to be candid and say that I've only read 2 of his stories, including the one we're going to look at today. But I've read that one probably 10 times, and I've taught it like 20 times. And I think, like I said, I have a sort of interpretation of this story, Diary of a Madman, that feels very relevant in America in 2021. For what it's worth, by the way, I don't have it here, but I did just receive a copy of the novel by Gene Wolfe called The Book of the New Sun that was recommended to me by a guy on Twitter. So I'm also reading that, and when I finish that, I'll probably go on to read the rest of these Lu Xun stories. To begin with, I want to read the first couple of paragraphs to you, and then add some very professional literary analysis, the kind that college literature professors ought to be doing when they're wasting their breath talking about race and gender fetishes instead. There are 13 chapters in this very short story, about a page apiece. following the preface, and the preface is what I want to read to you now. So, the preface is, at least in, I don't know if this is how it goes in Chinese, but it makes sense. In English, the preface is presented in italics. So it looks different than the rest of the story. And that's because what you get here is an interesting sort of framed narration. See if you can follow this, but even if you can't, at least listening to it, you would be able to do this if you read it. But just sort of take it in, and then I'll make the commentary afterwards that I hope will help you understand kind of why this story is so interesting. So it's called Diary of a Madman. There was once a pair of male siblings whose actual names I beg your indulgence to withhold. Suffice it to say that we three were boon companions during our school years. Subsequently, circumstances contrived to rend us asunder so that we were gradually bereft of knowledge regarding each other's activities. Not too long ago, however, I chanced to hear that one of them had been hard afflicted with a dread disease. I obtained this intelligence at a time when I happened to be returning to my native haunts, and hence made so bold as to detour somewhat from my normal course in order to visit them. I encountered but one of the siblings. He apprised me that it had been his younger brother who had suffered the dire illness. By now, however, he had long since become sound and fit again. In fact, he had already repaired to other parts to await a substantive official appointment. The elder brother apologized for having needlessly put me to the inconvenience of this visitation, and concluding his disquisition with a hearty smile, showed me 2 volumes of diaries, which, he assured me, would reveal the nature of his brother's disorder during those fearful days. As to the lapsus calami that occur in the course of the diaries, I have altered not a word. Nonetheless, I have changed all the names, despite the fact that their publication would be of no great consequence, since they are all humble villagers unknown to the world at large. Recorded this 2nd day in the 7th year of the Republic. All right. Which, by the way, was 1918, I think, at that point. So what you've got here that's so interesting is a frame, right? Now, like, I understand, as I said, it's sometimes more difficult to listen than to read, but it is important to understand what's going on here. And so, yes, first and most obviously, you've got this, it's actually kind of like a double frame job here. So, to begin with, you have what is presumably and supposedly just the voice of the author himself. Okay, now to understand literary framing, I mean, you really need to tune your ear here to narrative voice, or, perspective, literary perspective, POV. So, when you hear in the first sentence, as he says there, not long ago, however, I chanced to hear that one of, the brothers, right? in the first sentence, there was once a pair of male siblings whose actual names I beg your pardon or your indulgence to withhold. The I there that's speaking, it's basically just Lu Xun himself. Now, it's always possible, of course, that the first person speaker in a fiction is actually a fiction, and that could be the case here, but it's not really important, because whether it's the author himself or not, like, we get past it very quickly. Okay, here, again, whether it's actually Lu Xun or not, the key is to hear what is called the register of his narrating voice. And because you're not an expert like I am, I'm just going to clue you in. The voice of this narrator is relatively formal. I think probably the translation here is very good. If you listen back to it again, you'll hear that I'm reading, these are kind of like big fancy words. So you can maybe imagine a story narrated by somebody like Clark Gable or Yul Brynner or whatever. It's that almost like English sounding formality that kind of characterized what we hear as like mid-20th century dialect in America, right? Much more formal. So from this narrating voice, we hear about these 2 brothers that supposedly Lu Xun went to high school with. And he meets up with one of these brothers. And we have the sense that the younger brother was somehow suffering from a malady. He had some invalidity, right? Now, it's kind of like nebulous, though, isn't it? Well, in paragraph 2, which I just read to you, our narrator quotes the older brother. And the older brother also speaks in this rather formal dialect. And he says to our narrator that the younger brother is recovered now, has taken a post elsewhere. And, then the older brother hands our narrator a diary, which was kept by the younger brother during the time of this malady or invalidity. And already, you notice, if you're reading carefully, that there is some noticeable circumlocution, right? Like they're kind of like talking around this invalidity or whatever it is, a kind of careful use of euphemism to describe what's going on. I mean, what is the malady, and why is it called a dreaded disease, and why is the older brother so eager to insist that the younger brother is now recovered? And if he's recovered, why did he have to go and take a job elsewhere? And why does the older brother have his diary, right? And why is he sharing it with this narrator? So now, our narrator in all this says that he read the diary straight through, and he says his impression is that the writer of the diary suffered from a form of a persecution complex in this translation, which is a sort of a nice phrase to make it clear. He says, again, in his judgment, the writing was confused and incoherent. But he also tells us that we're going to get to read a section of the diary that he, the narrator, has copied out for the purposes of medical study. So that's the literary frame. That is how we get to the starting line of this story. And it's the only time the author or the narrator like intervenes in the story. Beyond that, it's just going to be the diary of the madman, supposedly. Okay? So as I said, the rest of the story is just younger brother himself talking. And we do not hear the judging voice of the narrator again. Okay, so now, what does you want to know, right? What does the diary say? I hope you feel that way because of the frame, I think you're sort of positioned to be, first of all, curious about it, but also when you go on to read it, you're reading as like a voyeuristic reader, right? Like you're gonna, ooh, good, like what's in the diary? I'm gonna open it up and read this crazy man's diary. Which, by the way, he says The Diary of a Madman was the title given to it by younger brother himself. Like he titled his own diary, Diary of a Madman. Okay, so before we get into this, just consider whether we want to trust the narrator and older brother, the guy he meets with, who give all kinds of signals here of being like normies, okay? Or do we maybe want to take seriously the POV of the younger brother, who, again, the normies say is suffering from a persecution complex? This gets us to our last important literary terminology for this episode. It's the question of the unreliable narrator. This story, because of its frame, gets away with presenting a very dissident view of things, you might say, by smuggling the dissident view in, by getting it like past the Chinese censors almost, under the name of, or the label, mad, right? But I think a smart reader can question the judgment of the frame or of the author, who essentially only intervenes at the outset, at the start, once or twice by calling this, basically paranoid or mentally unstable or incoherent or whatever. But in the 10 or so pages that follow, if you allow yourself to be taken in by the voice of the so-called supposed madman, you may come out seeing things differently than the narrator. And I gotta believe that's part of the very sort of interesting, sophisticated intention of the author at some level. All right, so again, if you just listen to, so now I'm going to read to you some of the story, but again, just to read that first sentence, just to tune your ear to that first sentence again of the frame, where the author himself speaks. He says, I'll just read you like 2 sentences. There was once a pair of male siblings whose actual names I beg your indulgence to withhold. Suffice it to say that we three were boon companions during our school years. Subsequently, circumstances contrived to rend us asunder, so that we were gradually bereft of knowledge regarding each other's activities. This is a perfect translation because it's like no one talks like this, right? This is a very formal, this is like somebody who's almost like aping 19th century old-fashioned English. Now, listen to the first couple sentences of the diary itself by younger brother, by the Madman. Moonlight's really nice tonight. Haven't seen it in over 30 years. Seeing it today, I feel like a new man. I know now that I've been completely out of things for the past 3 decades or more, but I've still got to be very careful. Otherwise, how do you explain those dirty looks the Zhao family's dog gave me? I've got good reason for my fears. And that's it. That's chapter 1, right there. That's it. Chapter 1 of the diary. I mean, isn't that paranoid and crazy and interesting and engaging, and you want to read more, right? Like what? The neighbor's dog is giving you mean looks? This is a paranoid freak, obviously. But I want to say, it's almost never this way in literature. In literature, as in the movies, if you get a character who's presented to you as crazy, like, a great example of this is actually Mel Gibson's old movie, what was it called? Conspiracy Theory or Conspiracy Theorist or something like that. And it's, it's a great scene. It's comparable to this. It opens up with that first scene where he's like latching the door. There's 16 locks on it, and he's, scoping out the window between the blinds and stuff. And so the movie introduces him to you as totally paranoid and crazy. But of course, it wouldn't be an interesting movie if it was just a movie about an insane man. Instead, he's onto something. And as the movie develops, you discover sort of with him that he's actually right, that he is being spied on and he has good reason for his fears. So this is a similar story in the same way. Now, I'm just going to, again, read some of this to you. You can feel his tone sort of intensify as we go. So in chapter 2, he says, for example, "No moonlight at all tonight. Something's not quite right. When I made my way out the front gate this morning, ever so carefully, there was something funny about the way the venerable old Zhao looked at me. Seemed as though he was afraid of me, and yet at the same time looked as though he had it in for me. There were 7 or 8 other people who had their heads together whispering about me. They were afraid I'd seen them, too. All up and down the street, people acted the same way. The meanest looking one of all spread his lips out wide and actually smiled at me. A shiver ran from the top of my head clear down to the tip of my toes, for I realized that meant they already had their henchmen well deployed and were ready to strike. But I wasn't going to let that intimidate me. I kept right on walking. There was a group of children up ahead, and they were talking about me, too. The expressions in their eyes were just like the venerable old Zhao's, and their faces were iron gray. I wondered what grudge the children had against me, that they were acting this way too. I couldn't contain myself any longer and shouted, 'Tell me! Tell me!' But they just ran away." So it goes on like this, and you go like, what's going on? Like, this guy is clearly out of his mind, right? Like, to just walk up to a bunch of kids and go, "Tell me, tell me." Like, of course they're going to run away. They're scared. They weren't talking about you. You're being paranoid, right? Now, before I go on, I do want you to think, okay, what is the difference between, for example, paranoia and like a just apprehension about things that you don't fully understand or know? I mean, that's possible. It is possible that, for instance, I don't know, like, the CIA is monitoring our text messages or whatever. Like that, and it's fun that we're reaching a point where you can just say that now because there's like news stories in the AP about it. Like, yeah, they are. It's called Project whatever, and it's based in Israel recently or something, okay? And it's maybe not the CIA, I don't remember. All right, keep reading. So from chapter 3, he says, I can never get to sleep at night. You really have to study something before you can understand it. Take all those people. Some have worn the king on the district magistrate's orders. Some have had their faces slapped by the gentry. Some have had their wives ravished by yamen clerks. Some have had their dads and moms done to death by creditors. And yet, right at the time when those terrible things were taking place, the expressions on their faces were never as frightened or as savage as the ones they wore yesterday. Strangest of all was that woman on the street. She slapped her son and said, "Damn it all, you've got me so riled up I could take a good bite right out of your hide. Right out of your hide." She was talking to him, but she was looking at me. I tried, but I couldn't conceal a shudder of fright. As I think of it now, a shiver's running from the top of my head clear down to the tip of my toes. If they're capable of eating people, then who's to say they won't eat me? Don't you see? That woman's words about taking a good bite, the laughter of that ghastly crew with their green faces and protruding fangs, and the words of our tenant farmer a few days back, it's perfectly clear to me now that all that talk and all that laughter were really a set of secret signals. Those words were poison, that laughter a knife. Their teeth are bared and waiting, white and razor sharp. Those people are cannibals. All right, so now he kind of announces it. And what happens is, of course, this mother is probably, you think, as a reader, because you're sane, you're a sane reader. And so you think that's just a thing that mothers say. I'll take a bite out of you, And then this paranoid guy develops it into people are eating each other. So he introduces the theme of cannibalism. Listen to this paragraph. He says, "You have to really go into something before you can understand it. I seem to remember, though not too clearly, that from ancient times on, people have often been eaten. And so I started leafing through a history book to look it up. There were no dates in this history, but scrawled this way and that across every page were the words benevolence, righteousness, and morality. Since I couldn't get to sleep anyway, I read that history very carefully for most of the night, and finally, I began to make out what was written between the lines. The whole volume was filled with a single phrase: eat people. The words were written in the history book. The things the tenant farmer said, all of it began to stare at me with hideous eyes, began to snarl and growl at me from behind bared teeth. Why, sure, I'm a person too, and they want to eat me. In chapter 4, he realizes that his own elder brother is a cannibal. This is the elder brother who gave the diary to the author, supposedly, right? So he says, his older brother sort of sees him losing it and says, "Don't let your thoughts run away with you. Just convalesce in peace and quiet for a few days and you'll be all right." And then the madman here says, "Don't let my thoughts run away with me? Convalesce in peace and quiet? If I convalesce till I'm good and fat, they will get to eat. But what do I get out of it? How can I possibly be all right? What a bunch. All they think about is eating human flesh, and then they go sneaking around, thinking up every which way they can to camouflage their real intentions. They were comical enough to crack anybody up. I couldn't hold it in any longer and let out a good laugh. Now that really felt good. I knew in my heart of hearts that my laughter was packed with courage and righteousness. And do you know what? They were so completely subdued by it that the old man and my elder brother both went pale. But the more courage I had, the more that made them want to eat me so that they could get a little of it for free. The old man walked out. Before he had taken many steps, he lowered his head and told elder brother to be eaten as soon as possible. He nodded understandingly. "So, elder brother, you're in it too." Although that discovery seemed unforeseen, it really wasn't either. My own elder brother had thrown in with the very people who wanted to eat me. My elder brother is a cannibal. I'm brother to a cannibal. Even though I'm to be the victim of cannibalism, I'm brother to a cannibal all the same. Now, what happens as you read this, I mean, he keeps developing what he sees as more and more evidence that people are eating each other. But as you're reading it, it starts to take on this kind of extra layer where the cannibalism maybe has something to do with like people's, I mean, look, I'm just going to tell you what I think it is like people's willingness to step on each other, stab each other in the back, basically take profit from each other. And cannibalism becomes like the figure for that, or it becomes the symbol for that. So, for instance, listen to this. When they decided to eat me, by yourself, of course, you couldn't do much to prevent it. But why did you have to go and join them? Cannibals are capable of anything. If they're capable of eating me, then they're capable of eating you too. Even within their own group. They think nothing of devouring each other. And yet, all they'd have to do is turn back, change, and then everything would be fine. Even though many people may say, it's always been like this, we can still do our best to improve. And we can start today. You're going to tell me that it can't be done. But elder brother, I think you're very likely to say that when that tenant wanted to reduce his rent the day before yesterday, wasn't it you who said it couldn't be done? And you see there the thing about rent reduction and cannibalism being like side by side. This gives you the clue. This kind of thing gives you the clue that like what we're really talking about here is, the change in human nature. Can we stop sinning? Can we stop sinning against each other? Okay, yeah, I'm having some recording trouble here. But so all of that kind of gives you a sense that there's going to be some symbolism happening here. It's not people like... There's not actually cannibalism, probably, you start to think in the story, but like maybe he like understands the essence of what's wrong with society. He's just become paranoid about it and he's processing it as if it's literal cannibalism, but it's kind of actually happening, right? And so his analysis becomes really interesting. I just want to read you, I'm going to read you the last page, basically, because it's not even a whole page, but I like how this story ends. Because you start to feel this guy's, he is going crazy. Like, he is losing it. And it's because everybody else is doing what he perceives as cannibalism, and he's trying not to do it, okay? So they're all out there participating in this kind of secret, crazy ritual that he finds repulsive, but he's also paranoid that they're coming after him. So I'm skipping to chapter 11 here. He says, the sun doesn't come out. The door doesn't open. It's 2 meals a day. I picked up my chopsticks, and that got me thinking about elder brother. I realized that the reason for my younger sister's death lay entirely with him. I can see her now. Such a lovable and helpless little thing, only 5 at the time. Mother couldn't stop crying, but he urged her to stop. Probably because he'd eaten sister's flesh himself, and hearing mother cry over her like that shamed him. But if he's still capable of feeling shame, then maybe younger sister was eaten by elder brother. I have no way of knowing whether mother knew about it or not. I think she did know, but while she was crying, she didn't say anything about it. She probably thought it was all right, too. I can remember once when I was 4 or 5, I was sitting out in the courtyard taking in a cool breeze when elder brother told me that when parents are ill, a son, in order to be counted as a really good person, should slice off a piece of his own flesh, boil it, and let them eat it. And by the way, there's a note there that says, in traditional literature, stories about such gruesome acts of filial piety were not unusual. Continuing, at the time, mother didn't come out and say there was anything wrong with that. But if it was all right to eat one piece, then there certainly wouldn't be anything wrong with her eating the whole body. And yet, when I think back to the way she cried and cried that day, it's enough to break my heart. It's all strange, very strange. And then chapter 12. Can't think about it anymore. I just realized today that I, too, have been muddled around for a good many years in a place where they've been continually eating people for 4,000 years. Younger sister happened to die at just the time when elder brother was in charge of the house. Who's to say he didn't slip some of her meat into the food we ate? Who's to say I didn't eat a few pieces of my younger sister's flesh without knowing it? And now it's my turn. Although I wasn't aware of it in the beginning, now that I know I'm someone with 4,000 years experience of cannibalism behind me, how hard it is to look real human beings in the eye. And then chapter 13, which ends with ellipses trailing off, very short, says, maybe there are some children around who still haven't eaten human flesh. Save the children. ... So 1918. So again, I'm not totally sure the author even intended this, but I think that what it gives us, like what it allows us to think about, is this idea of cannibalism as a, because he says, right, like people have been eating each other for 4,000 years. Well, not really. We don't really have evidence that the Chinese have been eating each other for 4,000 years. So instead, you have to sort of do the act of interpretation here. Like, what is the symbol that cannibalism implies? And it implies this thing where you're like consuming each other, where you're eating each other up, where it's a, dog eat dog world or something like that, right? And so this narrator, the madman, the diarist, the writer of the diary, sort of gets onto this idea that people are eating each other, and everyone around him is acting normal. He can't face it anymore. He sees it as disgusting. All of a sudden, everybody's eating each other, and there's no way out, and this is what we do, but maybe there are some children who haven't yet been initiated into this terrible death cult thing where we eat each other all the time. And so like his last thought is basically save the children. Now, as it says in the top frame at the start, he was sent to some psychiatric ward basically, and he recovered from this dread illness, and now he's repositioned in a, probably some outpost place, and he's got a new job, and he's recovered. Okay, well, think about that. Like, what does that mean? What it means is somehow he no longer goes around saying people are eating each other, right? But is that the kind of thing that you can unsee? I think it's not. I think more likely what happens is this guy sort of processes the fact that like there's no way out. Everyone's just eating each other. He kind of just realizes I'm doing it too. I mean, I used to talk to my class about this, and I would say, well, if this is just a symbol and people aren't actually eating each other, and the symbol, like, what is it? What do we mean? Like, what happens when people are cannibalizing each other? And they, okay, they're gobbling each other up, they're trouncing on each other's heads to get ahead in life and make profit and so on. But what are some examples of that? What would it mean for him? Like, why would he do that to his own younger sister? Why does it say elder brother, sort of ate a piece of younger sister's flesh? We have to really think about this, because what you want to do at that point is you go, it's just like at the end of the Dostoevsky story, where I said, if you watch my video on Notes from the Underground, I said that like he kind of traps you. Like, you don't realize it's going to be about you, right? You think, I'm not a cannibal. I don't do this to people. But look, man, if you applied for a job or something, for example, and 22 other people applied for that job, like, in some sense, you beat them out for the position, and you're kind of cannibalizing what might have been otherwise their livelihood. Like, that's the idea, right? So even siblings, like even, for example, imagine in China there's a family with 3 children in 1920. Say they can only afford to send one of them to college. Well, the one who goes, the first one, the older brother or whatever, in some sense, he's taking away from, younger sister's prospects in life, right? He's kind of like requiring her to serve his own ends. It becomes somewhat cannibalistic. Now, maybe this is just real life. Maybe it has to be this way. Maybe some people, I don't know, like take more than they give or whatever. Things don't work out equally. But the real devastating insight is where you realize you've been doing it too. Where it's like, it's not just other people that are cannibalizing, that are stepping on people's heads. No, like, and I used to love talking to like college students about this, because maybe you can make it through college, I would say, without cannibalizing people. I mean, in college, Like, you're basically just like in the system. You're going along for the ride. If anything, you're being cannibalized by the debtors and so on. But after college, as soon as you get a job, you start, taking a cut. You start looking for shortcuts. You start leaving early if you can, or you start selling your product to idiots. You start upselling them. You start using rhetoric to talk them into it. All of the kind of predatory edge of capitalism, you almost have to participate in. Like, as I've said, I'm looking for a job lately, and all the jobs I see look cannibalistic to me. I mean, it's basically like, do you want to be a copywriter where you basically like talk people into wanting to buy stuff they don't need? Or do you want to be an insurance salesman sort of taking a cut of their money to because they're afraid of things? Or, do you want to, basically every job to some degree aims at profit at someone else's expense. And once you see it this way, it does look kind of predatory, and you start to see how you yourself are involved in it. And that's part of what this story reveals. And then at the end, of course, and this is why Liu Jun is considered to be like a leftist, or even he never joined the Communist Party, but a sympathizer, is because at the end he says, we've been doing this for 4,000 years, but there was that early communist kind of energy that was like, maybe we can stop. Let's just change, right? But in fact, to me, that's the least compelling, least convincing part of this story. In fact, I go back to Romans 7. It's like, no, this is not something you can change. This is in our nature. The predatory, exploitative, this impulse. It is a dog-eat-dog world. We do have to chew each other up at some sense. Now, you might look at the children and go, can we save the children? Can we diminish the degree to which they have to do this to one another? Could we create communities that aren't as exploitative? Maybe we could go back to something like, labor unions and so on that would give some protection to, mere laborers so that they don't have to always be elbowing their way in and taking bites out of other people. But anyway, I recommend the story. It's really interesting. It gives you a window into, the Chinese mind is so different. I'm sure there are parts of this story I don't even understand, but it gives you a mind to, if you read this and you read Kafka's Metamorphosis and you read Melville's Bartleby, you see very similar themes in all of them, and all of them are written right at the beginning of this kind of modern or hyper-modern world where people have daily commutes, where there's a bureaucracy, where status and money and power are all sort of exchanged for these jobs that don't really make any sense to us, that, as Marx said, people's labor is alienated from the product of the labor, and it's very disorienting. And it's interesting that the same kinds of stories bubble up in very different civilizations as a response, or you might even say as a symptom of this new world order that is, modern capitalism, something like that. So that's the Liu Jun story. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time. I think I'm going to try to get back to Plutarch here pretty soon. I had some requests for the classics again. We can do that for sure. See you next time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.